Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Word of the Day for Wednesday, October 1st. I'm your host, Rene Holaday, and this morning we have a great random turning that is covering a topic that we don't cover very often here. And so, kind of nice to see it. The random turning for today comes to us from 2 Corinthians chapter 9 that reads under the title Administering the Gift. And it reads, Now concerning the ministering to the saints, it is superfluous for me to write to you, for I know your willingness, about which I boast of you to the Macedonians, that Achaia was ready a year ago, and your zeal has stirred up the majority. Yet I have sent the brethren, lest our boasting of you should be in vain in this respect, that, as I said, you may be ready, lest if some Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, not to mention you, should be ashamed of this confident boasting. Therefore I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren to go to you ahead of time and prepare your bountiful gift beforehand, which you had previously promised, that it might be ready as a matter of generosity and not as a grudging obligation. The cheerful giver. But this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. So let each one give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that you, always having all sufficiency in all things, have an abundance for every good work. As it is written, He has dispersed abroad, He has given to the poor, His righteousness remains forever. Now may He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food supply and multiply the seed you have sown and increase the fruits of your righteousness. While you are enriched in everything for liberality, which causes thanksgiving through us to God, for the administration of this service not only supplies the needs of the saints, but also is abounding through many thanksgivings to God. While through the proof of this ministry they glorify God for the obedience of your confession to the gospel of Christ, and for your liberal sharing with them and all men, and by their prayer for you, who long for you because of the exceeding grace of God in you. Thanks be to God for his indescribable gift. And that's it. Well, that is such a nice thing to read because, uh, you know, each of us have different propensities that we excel in. Some people are they gravitate towards helping people hands-on missions. They love the whole topic of healing. They seem to have um, a, the blessing for it, the calling for it. Other people are, you know, talented in all sorts of different ways. I think that one of the blessings that God endows us with is the desire to give and be a cheerful giver. Some people don't have that natural inkling that they want to do that, and so it's an issue more of like self control. Like they have to they have to force themselves, because not all of us have all of these great attributes where we're called to have them. We're called to uh, walk in the way that Christ did. And a lot of that doesn't come natural for everybody. And so, areas where you're weak, you have to work at it and, pay special attention in order to walk like Christ and walk in his ways. And so, this whole idea of being a cheerful giver, that is that's something that comes naturally to me. That is probably a learned behavior from my own family. My family that I grew up around were extremely giving. They loved to give, and so I learned that behavior from them. And I have absolutely no problem with it. I enjoy it. I love it. I look forward to it. I like to give the best gifts possible. If I could, if I could actually go find a job, if I was to do something like go and pick my perfect job, I was thinking that it would be such an awesome job to work for some of these mega churches, and I would want to be the executive gift giver. I'm not kidding. The one that lines out all of the the gifts, or who gets what, how much to each different group of people that are in need. I love that kind of stuff. I would, gosh, oh boy, wouldn't I love that job. I want to be the head gift giver. Right? Because I love to give more than people expect. I love to give generously. I like to see people happy, and I like to see them surprised that it surpassed their expectations. And so this is kind of what Paul is talking about here with this group of people. They have taken a collection, and they have a reputation now for being such great givers. And so this chapter has a word wealth that is focused on cheerful. The word cheerful comes from hilaros, right? A Greek word which means willing, good natured, joyfully ready. The word describes a spirit of enjoyment in giving that sweeps away all restraints. The English word hilarious is a transliteration. And so you don't necessarily think of cheerful as being associated or defined with the base word of hilarious, but just the fact that joyfully ready, it says joyfully ready. So you're already joyful, you're joyfully ready, you're exuberant. And so that describes a cheerful giver with the root word of hilarious, right? So much fun, it's hilarious. It's just, I'm sure you've all laughed so much because, you're just dying laughing at some point because it's not just funny, it's hilarious, right? Well, that kind of joy, that kind of just like it says, joyfully ready. And so, what this describes in the notes is, well, let's take a look at the notes because the notes are good on this one as well. It says here that in verse 3, where it's describing, yet I have sent the brethren, lest our boasting of you should be in vain in this respect, that as I said, you may be ready. And so that describes here that the brethren are the delegation sent to prepare the offering before Paul arrives. And in verse 6, it says, under the cheerful giver, it says, but this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. And so the notes there say, giving bountifully, literally with blessings, blesses both the recipients and those who give. And so, boy, if that statement isn't a true reference to God's character, that is exactly how God works. How you treat others is how he's going to treat you. How the measure which you forgive others is the measure which he is going to forgive you. Basically, he lets you set the example for how he's going to treat you. And so if you struggle in this area of giving, you just, maybe you didn't grow up like that. Maybe you grew up in a very reserved household, that, or maybe you didn't have much. Maybe you grew up in a household that didn't have much to give. And so um, that whole behavior is also something that piques God's interest, that however much you give is what's given back to you. If you sow sparingly, you will reap sparingly. And so it's almost like throughout your life, God holds up a mirror to you and says, okay, everything that you're doing outward is going to be reflected back to you. So here's your mirror, you know, treat others the way you want to be treated, right? Which is exactly indicative of a mirror, God holding up the mirror. Do you want to be blessed richly? Then give richly, give generously, give more than you're able. And especially when it is to the church. Because first of all, God's financial system is based on tithing, as we all know. And you're not restricted to just giving 10%. In fact, at different times when God says, test me on this. If if you don't believe that I will open up the doors of heaven and pour it back to you, test me on this. He doesn't want you to test him anywhere else, but he says, test me on that. And so different times in my past, I have tested him, and I went, you know what, I don't want to be considered just scraping by with the 10% that I'm giving to whichever group, whichever church, whichever ministry, whether it be to International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, whether it be for one for Israel.org, or the Troy Brewer ministry who saves trafficked children. I like to throw it out there to God, say, I don't want to just give the basic requirement. I don't want to just skate by with what I am forced to give or have to give. I want to do better than that. I want to be a generous giver. And so I will up my tithing to 20%, at least double what I've been required to, that I can experience the idea of giving where just because what does it mean to be a generous giver? What does that cost me? And the other thing about giving is what does it cost you? God wants to know that it costs you something, that if it's not like somebody else gave you their money and then you just give it to them and then it's easy for you, right? If it's somebody else's money, it's easy to give. No, that's not what giving's all about. Giving changes your heart because it costs you something. It costs you to help somebody else. And who does that remind you of? Jesus himself. He look at he gave everything. He he had no material possessions. He gave his own blood. He gave his own blood. And so he wants to know if he's willing to give not just his life, but his blood, and being horribly brutalized and tortured, and then tortured to death, essentially, is what crucifixion is. And so if he's willing to give that much for you, how much are you willing to give for others? Does it cost you anything? I mean, does it like make you uncomfortable in any way, or is it just, do you only give what is comfortable, what doesn't cost you too much, right? And another example of that giver is the widow, the widow and her two mites that she gave, because even though she had nothing, she gave two mites. And so it doesn't matter if you've got a lot. That is never the basis that God looks at in your giving. Is It doesn't matter if you've got a lot or if you've got a little. He requires at least 10%. And if you're generous beyond that, whether it's a little in the total amount or whether it is, a lot, you may be either destitute or you may be a millionaire. But 10% given by a millionaire is probably less costly to that millionaire than it is to somebody who's destitute and gives their 10%. And where that 10% might be life changing to somebody who's destitute. And so that is what God's looking at, is what's on your heart, and how much are you willing to be inconvenienced or let it cost you in order to help others. And that is what he is developing in the fact that he calls us to give all the time, regularly. That's part of his system. Part of his system is the circle that I've described before, where once you get into the tithing, you've paid your 10%, and now you're on this circle. You're on the circular system that you keep giving and it keeps coming back to you, and you keep giving and it keeps coming back to you. And so long as you're giving, it keeps coming back to you. And so the more you give, the more comes back to you, as Paul is saying right there that in that verse of 6. But this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. And so giving is just once you actually get used to it, if you haven't been used to it, try it out. Try it out. God gave everything he had for you. God gave his son, and Jesus gave his life and his blood. And so this is an education system for turning your heart into a heart that likes to give, that you can be like Christ, that we can walk in his ways, we can experience the blessing of watching somebody else's life be benefited, because of what you did, the fun of how much what you did benefited others. And so, there's it's a joy, like that word describes in cheerful. It's joyful readiness. And so, or joyfully ready is exactly what it said. But, and in addition to that, this is, like I was describing, this is changing your heart. And especially if you're not accustomed to giving and it's not one of your strong suits, learning to give is actually more fun than you think it is. Once you have no idea how much fun it is until you actually start. And once you start and you see the results, it becomes like a blessing to you. In fact, at one point when I was helping at a homeless shelter, I wrote a poem about about how I went there to give and ended up taking, meaning that I was the one. I was blessed by it so much just because of the experience of watching it make people so happy. They're so happy. They felt so thankful and so blessed that I felt like I was the one that received the biggest blessing when I went to the homeless shelter to help. So that was, more or less what this poem was about, was the irony of going to the homeless shelter to give and leaving only taking, right? It's a truth. And so um and it's the kind of blessing that, like I said, if you're not good at it and you're not accustomed to it, you can't imagine that it would be fun, because all it looks like or feels like to you is going to be a loss. You're going to be surprised. I mean, it makes your life better to watch somebody else's life improve because of something that you have done. And so giving almost can become addictive. I mean, it's so much fun that it can become addictive, and then you realize how much giving blesses you. It blesses you because it blesses the people that you're giving to, and just being able to be in that environment and to watch that exchange that is so uh, against the natural way of this world, that is cutthroat, that it is dog eat dog, and survival of the fittest. That is the nature of this world. And so when you go against the grain and see how much you can give, it's shocking. The results are shocking. Instead of the survival of the fittest mentality, and always having to one up the other person to try to get ahead and achieve. When you're giving away, it's the exact opposite of this world. And so it's amazing what happens. So I'd encourage everyone out there, of course, give to your church. Always give to your church first. Your tithe, right off the top of whatever you have, your tithe always goes to your church or whoever it is that is feeding your spiritual growth, because that is a requirement. God requires that of you as a minimum. And if that's your sparingly giving, if you just do the 10%, then you'll receive sparingly, but at least you'll be doing what you're supposed to, what God requires of you, lest you rob God, like it describes in Malachi chapter 3, where people say, "What do you mean where we have robbed you?" And God says, "In your tithes, you have not tithed, and you're robbing God if you're not tithing." So the first 10% of your income must go to whoever is your church or the organizations that you're supporting to help the Jews, help the needy, help the widows, the orphans. That comes out first. Beyond that, any giving that you do, that's entirely up to you and your generosity, right? But once you start, I warn you, once you start, it's addictive. and it's a blast. All right, everyone. Well, I hope this is a blessing to you. And I'll also hope that you will join me again tomorrow, and we'll see what the Lord has in store for us for tomorrow. You will have a wonderful and a blessed day.